Hello everyone, and welcome to this joint CIEEM and Fourth Estuary Forum webinar on biodiversity and planning. Okay. Apologies, I'm working from home with my daughter. So this webinar on biodiversity and planning on the 4th. I will shortly be handing over to Chris, who will formally introduce the webinar. But I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping. So there is the chat function which you can use to share information with other delegates. And we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please do pop your questions in to the Q&A box and we'll look to answer those at the end. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you all for logging in to attend this first Fourth Estuary Forum webinar on issues pertinent to the Fourth. For those of you, my name is Christopher Cutts, I'm the Forum Manager of the Forum. For those of you who are not familiar with the Fourth Estuary Forum, we're one of several local coastal partnerships on the Scottish coast, all broadly tasked with promoting their wise and sustainable use of their own particular bits of coastline. In particular, with the Fourth Estuary Forum, we do this by working towards a vision of an inclusive and integrated community of stakeholder organisations that together act to sustain and promote the tidal river and estuary, the waterfront, the coasts and the seas around that, which together compose the Fourth Coastal Region. To be more specific, we see our role is to bring together, facilitate and inspire public, private and voluntary and community organisations to think and act collaboratively for the present time and the future benefits for the natural environment, economic prosperity and public recreation and well-being. These aspects are all interrelated, of course, which is why we take an integrated collaborative approach. But it is with this role in mind when we decided to launch a series of webinars on issues pertinent to the Fourth, starting with today's topic of biodiversity and planning on the Fourth. It's said in the State of Nature report published last year that the abundance and distribution of the UK species has on average declined since 1970, and many metrics suggest this decline has continued in the most recent decade. There's been no let-up in the net loss of nature in the UK. So today, we hope to update yourselves, a local expert and interested audience, on the best current thinking in relation to underlying issues affecting specifically coastal biodiversity on the Fourth, and how the two statutory planning regimes of terrestrial and more recently national marine planning can ameliorate them. The relationship between these two regimes and their alignment will be essential going forward. Together, the attendees today, you all represent lots of different organisations, and local authorities, public bodies and stakeholder organisations can protect and enhance biodiversity in several ways, including adopting an integrated strategic planning approach to biodiversity in local plans and local nature recovery networks, promoting biodiverse developments through their own planning obligations, managing local government public assets to enhance biodiversity, collaboratively working with other local authorities, public bodies and local stakeholders, embedding biodiversity evaluation and monitoring in their own processes, and establishing very robust financial and long-term management arrangements. So we'll be touching on a lot of these with the 4 presentations just about to come up. So I'm very pleased today that the 4 speakers have agreed to present on their highly relevant and expert work. That's enough for me by way of preamble. So I'd first like to present Fiona Munro from Marine Scotland's Licensing Operations team, who will be talking about licensing along the Scottish coast. Fiona's been a casework manager in the Licensing Operations team for the Scottish Government for just over a year. Previously to that, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Stirling looking at impacts of Brexit on energy policy. And prior to that, she has a PhD in human geography and energy policy. So thank you very much for presenting, Fiona. Over to you.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. There we go, great. So Today I'm going to talk about just the general process of marine licensing and answer any questions you have. If you have questions that are about a really specific case, I may not be able to answer them, but we're always happy to receive emails and answer specific questions about specific cases. And basically, so I'm part of the Marine Scotland licensing operations team, MS LOT for short, and we are the regulators for licensing in Scottish waters, and we're a team of about 30 people. And we're split into marine licensing, which is where I am, and then there's offshore renewables consenting, which is dealt with a bit differently. And then there's also a business and operational delivery part of the team and a HRA, environmental impact assessment part of the team as well. So I'm gonna just highlight some of the legislation that we work on, as well as the licensable marine activities that we license, and also just how the licensing process works as well. So in terms of marine licensing, this is a screenshot of the part of the Act which explains which activities we do license. But basically the purpose of the Act is to protect the environment, protect human health, and prevent interference with legitimate uses of the sea. And that's under Part 4 of the Act. And we also, Section 24 defines what is licensable. So in terms of what is licensable, there's quite a range of activities. So this includes things like depositing, constructing, and dredging are some of the key things. But so MS LOT, we're responsible for issuing licenses on behalf of Scottish ministers. And marine licenses are issued under Part 4 of the Marine Scotland Act. And this covers basically the area from mean high water springs along the coast out to 12 nautical miles. And then we have the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009, which is for activities in the offshore region, and that goes out to 200 nautical miles. So it's quite a large area. And a marine license is required for things like to deposit any substance or object within the Scottish marine area. This can be either in the sea or on or under the seabed. So that can be things like anchored moorings or pontoons or land reclamation. We also cover the construct, alter, or improve any works within the Scottish marine area. And this is either in or on or under the seabed. So that could be things like piled structures or rock armor, that sort of thing. We also license in terms of to carry out any form of dredging within the Scottish marine area, and that's whether or not there's removal of the actual material being dredged, and we'd also license the deposit of that material if it was below mean high water springs. We also license the deposit or use of any explosive substances or articles within the Scottish marine area, as well as removal of substances or objects. So if there was a sunken ship or something and it was being reclaimed. There's also other consents that are considered, that we don't consider. So we do the marine licensing aspect, but depending on what the activity is, it often requires other permissions like planning permission or permission from Crown Estate, the Harbour or Port Authority, or Transport Scotland, SEPA, those kind of bodies. So, and a marine license doesn't mean that those other types of requirements are not required. In terms of oil and gas, we don't deal with that because it's a reserved power for the UK government, so that anything oil and gas related is basically dealt with by the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy team. And the Marine Scotland Act also doesn't apply basically to anything fishing related. All license applications received and license issued are published on our website, so you could at any time can go online to the Marine Scotland website and see any of our licenses or applications we have. We also license European protected species and basking shark disturbance, as well as seal licensing and environmental impact assessments. So it's quite a broad range of activities. So, but the next thing is what is the sea, and where are we licensing? And it is quite broad. So in the Marine Scotland Act, how the sea is defined is that it's the area of the sea within the seaward limit of the territorial sea of the UK adjacent to Scotland, and it includes the bed and the subsoil of the sea within that area. So the key being that it's not just the water, it's also the bed and the subsoil of the sea within that area. And basically anything that's submerged at mean high water springs tide will be within that area. And the waters the waters of every estuary, river, or channel so far as the tide flows at mean high water springs tide is also included. So we take that as being the normal tidal limit. So just to give you an example of how far that can be, here's the River Forth, and if everyone could have a look and think about where you would consider that the normal tidal limit to be. The next slide, I'll show you where it actually is. So it's actually all the way up, just above Stirling. So if there's anything within, such as, let's say, a bridge that crosses over the river below that, and there's works on that bridge, that would be considered within the area that would require a marine license. Oh, sorry, I double clicked there. I was going to show you the River Tay. So I've already given it away, but that's where the normal tidal limit is. It goes all the way up for Perth there. So in terms of the different activities that we license, this is just a pie chart showing what the projects we've licensed in the past 12 months and sort of the proportion of what kind of things we're licensing. So in the past 5 years, on average, we're licensing about 488 marine licenses per year. And it's quite, and that's not including the renewable energy project licenses. It does actually include that for this one. There's a range of projects we license. So some are very small projects, such as maybe a single mooring even, or a marine farm, up to multi-million-pound harbour developments and marine cables as well. We take a proportional approach to licensing, so large-scale projects and those in more sensitive areas, which have the potential to cause much larger impacts, where we routinely seek additional input from consultees to quantify or suggest mitigation. In terms of construction projects, these would include things like coastal protection repairs or the construction of outfall pipes, piers or jetties, bridges where they cross the tidal part of a river, as well as harbour work or land reclamation. So it's quite a wide range of varying scale and potential impact with those types of works. We also do quite a bit of dredging licensing, and so because that's quite frequently for harbours required, and we do licensing for the maintenance dredging or also for capital, which is if dredging hasn't been done recently, it's treated a little bit differently because we need additional information. And we also deal with the disposal or deposit of that materials as well, because if it's being dredged, it often is needing to go somewhere else. So we also license that part as well. We also license sediment sampling and scientific purpose type experiments and things like that. But there's not that many of those we actually license because a lot of those fall under exemptions. And yeah, and then you can see there's quite a lot of wellboat discharge licensing. And for those, we're only licensing the discharge of those chemicals. CIEEM covers the car license, the actual licensing of the amount of chemicals. So we're licensing the deposit of them into the ocean, basically. And then we license quite a lot of marine farms, and for finfish and shellfish farms, for those, we are only licensing the issues based on safety of navigation only. And for those, other aspects are considered under planning and by CIEEM. So it can be kind of confusing because it depends on what we're licensing and what we're considering and what's covered by a marine license. So just to go over the general process, this is quite a simplified process map of what we do, but for sort of a standard simple license, this is the process we go through. So, and then for other more complicated licenses, there's other things, additional things that have to be done. But so initially we'll receive an application and we'll review it, and we basically just make sure that we've got all the information we need, and we'll clarify with the applicant if there's any additional information required. And then at that stage, we'll accept the application and then accept payment as well. So at that point, an application will go to public notice if it is a new site. And at that stage, that's where the applicant must publish details of the works in a local newspaper, and they make documents available in a public building as well. And that basically informs local people of the works and gives them an opportunity to comment on the project. And then we'll start the consultation process with appropriate groups. And this is a 28-day process. This is where we will consult with statutory consultees. And for them, it's a requirement under the regulations that they have to give us a consultation response. Those tend to be the Northern Lighthouse Board, the Maritime Coastal Agency, NatureScot, previously SNH, and SEPA as well. And there are others depending on what the local area is. And then at the same time, we also consult with non-statutory consultees. So those will be determined based on the location of the works of the project and the potential impacts. And they do not have to respond, but we very much appreciate getting responses from them. In terms of consultation responses, once we've received those, we send them all to the applicants so that they can respond if they want to. And then the final part is where we determine the application and decide if it's appropriate to issue the license for that time period. And we also put any additional or any appropriate conditions based on the consultation responses we receive. Protected sites and objections tend to take more time, and there's a process to them as well, with additional assessments sometimes required, particularly if it's activity in a protected site. And all the documents and licenses are all uploaded to our website as well. And we tend to have a target of about 14 weeks to process an application. It's not a statutory timeline though for that, so we work towards that, but it often takes longer if there's additional types of assessments required. So in terms of consultation responses and what kinds of conditions that we'll add on to a license or include in a license, depending on the responses, are things like around the lighting and marking, particularly for like a marine farm, whether they need to conduct a notice to mariners, if there's any reporting requirements, which we often have because we want to know exactly what has been, let's say, deposited. There'll be sometimes measures around prevention of environmental damage, time restrictions, so what time of year they can do the works, or even during the day, what time. There's also other restrictions, and it just depends on, it's very much a case-by-case basis for that. But ultimately, we are the regulator and we make a decision, and sometimes not all parties are, some parties may be disappointed at the end of the day, because sometimes we do receive conflicting advice from consultees, so we have to weigh that all out. And just to highlight that some other aspects of marine licensing is that sometimes for certain types of projects, if a project meets a certain threshold, it has to do sort of additional pre-application consultation. And this is basically a whole consultation process that has to happen before a marine license application is even submitted. So that would be something like for a bridge or causeway or walkway that's even longer than 50 meters in length. But there's quite a long list in the regulations of types of projects that would require that additional consultation. There's also environmental impact assessment. So for certain types of projects, if there's going to be a significant impact on the environment, then they require a whole nother assessment and process as well. So I won't go into that, but they're quite a bit more intensive and time intensive as well. And we also license, there's exemptions from licensing And for those, there's different types, but some require our approval. Some just require us to have a notice of intention to carry out that activity, and then some don't need our approval at all. So it really does vary. So, but yeah, so that's just a run through. We've got a lot of guidance online, and if you have any questions, you can always contact us. Great, I will just stop presenting so I can pass it over.
Thank you, Fiona. That was an excellent sort of run through of what's obviously a very, very technical and involved process, and very important to know. Thank you for that. Next up, we have John Faubert from Jacobs on the Queensferry Crossing and St. Margaret's Marsh.
Right, let's see.
John, sorry?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's see if we can get this sharing to work.
Okay, well, I'll just introduce you so you can get that set up. John is a consultant ecologist based in Glasgow. He's been working in consultancy for over 25 years, mainly on plants and habitats. He joined Jacobs 12 years ago to work on the Queensferry Crossing project, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and he's been involved with it ever since. So thank you very much, John. Look forward to this one.
Hi, everybody. Well, as Chris was saying, I joined Jacobs 12 years ago, and the first project I began to work on was the Queensferry Crossing. I'm still working on it a little bit, off and on now, so I'll probably never manage to get away from it completely. So I'm going to briefly mention the reasons why the Queensferry Crossing was constructed. So the original Forth Road Bridge was opened in 1964. It was designed for 4 million vehicles a year and HGVs of 24 tons. By 2004, it was getting 24 million vehicles a year and with HGVs of 44 tons, so quite a significant change. It did have a design life of 120 years, but I'm sure, as many of you will know, it was deteriorating. There was salt erosion in the cables and things. So it was decided it was no longer suitable as the long-term main crossing. There were other issues as well. I think some of you might recall that it used to be regularly closed during high winds and things like this. So in December 2007, a decision was made that there needed to be a new bridge. It was going to be a cable-stayed bridge, and the picture there shows you what the artist's impression of what it was proposed to look like. In 2011, construction started, and in 2017, the actual new Queensferry Crossing opened to the public. So St. Margaret's Marsh, well, this is a triple SI that lies on the north side of the Firth of Forth between North Queensferry and Rosyth. It's actually a completely man-made site, which is sort of quite important to the story to see how it developed and what we need to do about it. So I'm going to go through this a little bit. So in 1903, approval was given for a construction of a dockyard at Rosyth, and this was quite a big area, you know, sort of 480 hectares of land and 115 hectares of foreshore. And this was constructed between 1909 and 1916. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of arisings came from this. There was a lot of dredging went on. And in 1943, a retaining wall was constructed sort of downstream of the dockyard, and lagoons were created. Into this, they tipped a lot of these arisings and the waste and dredgings and that sort of thing. And we can see this map from the 19th century. You can see there I've marked Rosyth Castle and North Queensferry. And between there's a large bay where it says St. Margaret's Home, and that was the natural coastline. So it's actually before the Forth Bridge, that's the railway bridge, was built, and even before the branch line to Queensferry. So it's quite an old map of what the area looked like. That's the area we're interested in, which is really where the whole dockyard in the area was constructed. This is from the sort of early half of the 19th century, and as you can see, there's a very straight coastline there now. The brown contour towards the top, the thick one just below the 100 meters, is approximately the area of what the original coastline was like. And you can still see that there's a little bay remaining there. This eventually did get filled in as well. And you can see this on the next picture. Again, there's the brown contour sort of marks the old shoreline, and as is typical of maps of this period, they just blanked out any idea of that there might be a dockyard there. So dredging continued between 1905 and 1945, and they dumped all the dredgings in these two lagoons, and they also built sewage works, and so a lot of the material from that went in, and also domestic waste and all sorts of things. But there was still quite a lot of...
John, sorry, it's Chris again here. There seems to be a sort of a black box in the middle of your screen that we can see with is cuts part of my name on it. That show
right, there's nothing showing on my screen that indicates this.
Oh. Well, we'll just carry on and sort of work around that. It's just a bit of a black box in the middle.
Okay, this is slightly frustrating. It's probably because I've got such an old laptop now.
I'm sorry. We'll just carry on.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So anyway, the open water in the lagoons disappeared, and these sluice valves were constructed to allow seawater to go into the lagoon areas. Sorry, I'm slightly slightly off kilter now. Anyway, in 1992, they replaced the old sluice valve because it was obviously deteriorating. Seawater is not great for metal, as you can imagine. So, and they tried to replace it with a simple rubber flat valve. And then in 1996, they designated it as a SSSI. And they put a management agreement in at this time, or slightly later, to try and increase the seawater, but it didn't really work that well, and there wasn't enough seawater getting into the site. There was a bit of partial denotification in 2008, and then in 2011 it was compulsory purchased as part of the Queensferry Crossing scheme. So quickly review it. It was formed by dredging, contained by seawall, and as I said, it was designated, and this was for two reasons. Transition salt marsh, which is basically sort of reed bed type habitat, and the salt marsh itself, which was calculated at 2.25 hectares. And the total area ended up as just over 24 hectares. That was after the partial denotification. But when they did the condition assessment in 2009, 2011, so just before construction started, it was in poor condition, and this was generally due to low seawater levels. And this is sort of an aerial photography of the site prior to construction, although it does show the a road crossing it, the B981. The yellow area marks the area of salt marsh, and the little blue area there is an area of what was the remaining area of open water after all the reed bed had sort of covered it all. This figure shows the proposed scheme at the time, and as you can see, there was a road which was going to be the new access road to North Queensferry, cut across the SSSI. The red boundary marks the SSSI boundary, and this was you know, obviously quite a big thing to lose a bit of SSSI, and what the implications were this in parts of the habitat was the loss and fragmentation of reed bed. That was one of the designated habitat types, and also the loss of rough grassland and scrub. There was less of an issue in that, but the reed bed was certainly you know, quite a significant impact as a result of the scheme. So the reed bed itself, it's 15.6 hectares. This is the largest area in the Firth of Forth, but you know, there are even larger reed beds in the Firth of Tay, so it may be not that important in itself. It's dominated by common reed, and it's up to 2.5 meters in height. This is quite high. It's probably higher than that, maybe 3.5 meters. This is probably due to possible inputs from the sewage works, you know, nutrient inputs and that sort of thing. But the important thing is that once you get into the reed bed itself, there's virtually no other species. And the designation was actually for transition salt marsh, which is a sort of a mixture of salt marsh and common reed habitat. So the common reed that is there isn't really fulfilling its purpose as a transition salt marsh habitat. The salt marsh itself is SN13, that's an MVC community, which is Fuchsilia maritima salt marsh community. This is actually quite a broad habitat type and covers sort of quite a variation in composition even. Salt marshes in the Firth of Forth tend to be of low diversity, they've got a low species richness, and in generally a poor fit to this salt marsh type anyway. It was approximately 0.27 hectares in 2012, and remember when I said before it had been about 2.25 hectares. That's what is designated area, so it's obviously declined quite a lot. Originally, it showed a good transition from lower to mid to upper salt marsh, but there'd been a decline in this transition, and this is all due to this lack of seawater getting into the salt marsh. This also explains why the reed bed was just all sort of one species, common reed, rather than a variety of types. There was also a transition zone between the salt marsh and the reed bed itself, and you can see here where you get the common reed going into the salt marsh. It's quite a lot shorter in height. It doesn't tend to flower as much, but it can be quite wide in some areas. So our approach to the mitigation was that in consultation with SNH, we developed a strategy and we put forward a number of options which could be taken forward. And this was basically to implement a management strategy to improve the site's condition as far as possible. Normally for triple SIs, any habitat that is lost to the scheme is replaced. Now, we were losing common reed habitat, so actually SNH weren't too worried about this because what they were really bothered about was the salt marsh habitat. So they wanted to improve the unfavourable status for both, and this was would be through increasing the amount of seawater that would be flooding the marsh. There were some other things we needed to do as well, which was improve access or increase amenity value of the site. And also there was a large stand of giant hogweed. So that's the other thing we wanted to remove, was the giant hogweed. It was always accepted that this would be a live and reactive and partly experimental management. So all the time that we've been undertaking this, we've been reacting to what we've seen and trying to change things or improve things as we've gone along. So if we look at the original scheme design and the salt marsh, the first thing was we were going to have 3 tidal sluices going through the seawall there. Number 1 marks the original sluice that was put in before our time, and the next to the yellow area of salt marsh. We were then going to have 5 internal sluices to try and connect up all the different reed beds, hoping that we could sort of flush the whole marsh with reed bed. Although we were flush the whole marsh with seawater. Although we were well aware that the area had different levels, and we weren't entirely sure what ground level was, because with 2 to 3 meter high reed bed, it's almost impossible to tell what that height is. So these are the tidal sluices. They were relatively straightforward. We got a big digger, put a big hole in the seawall and put a pre-constructed concrete culvert in. And there was a chamber on the other side, which meant that we were able to simply manage the seawater ingress and egress. And you can see sort of through this, these are basically like large railway sleeper lumps of wood that we simply slotted in. And these held back the seawater so that you could retain a high level of seawater in the marsh. And you can see in the picture there, that's during a sort of a high tide where the seawater just floods in through the culvert and floods the salt marsh area. So we were quite early on, it was obviously successful at getting seawater, certainly into the salt marsh area as well. It seemed to be less successful at getting into the reed bed. And so we decided to firstly open up a reed bed. So we got a JCB and just ran it across the site, flattening down the reeds, hoping to reduce their productivity and growth and get other species in. But it became a bit clear that there was quite a lot of regrowth and there wasn't a huge amount of water getting in. So the first thing we did after that was just dig channels through the marsh to try and increase the amount of salt water that was getting in and then would be retained after a high tide. And this aerial view quite nicely shows what happened. So you can see the channels there coming in from the sluices in the seawall, and the idea was that these would connect with all the internal sluices as well. And you can also see there, actually vaguely see there perhaps, that there was quite a bit of water in at least some of the channels anyway. So in November 2017, we had quite a bit of seawater coming in, and you can see there, this is at the far end, away from the seawall. There's water there, there's a lot of bare ground. But there's a lot odd little green plants coming in here, which you can see marked by that yellow ring there. This is actually Lesser Sea Spurry, Spurgularia marina, which is a high marsh plant. So it was we're thinking, great, these plants are coming in quite early on. So we are getting some salt marsh plants coming in. Approximately 2 years later, 2019, there has been quite a lot of growth in the reeds there. This is the same location. There's an awful lot of salt marsh plants growing there. You can see those in the foreground. Particularly of interest is this plant here, sea aster. Nice flowering plant there. So these were all coming in, whether they were coming in with the water or whether they were always there in the mud and just being allowed to regrow because the reeds are being cleared. We're not 100% sure, but the fact is that the reeds weren't coming back as great as we perhaps might imagine, presumably because of the salt water there. As well as opening up the reeds, obviously we were actually concerned about the initial area of salt marsh, which is this blue area here. It had originally been much greater. It had encompassed this area, which is now coastal grassland. So we did some measurements of the site. This lady here, my colleague, is doing a survey in 2017. This is using the very accurate measurement techniques that the engineers use on the bridge itself. So that's probably the most accurate survey that's ever been done. And we did that after the sluices had been installed. This is a very brief run through of the various measurements we did. The important things to note was that in 2008, SNH said it was 2.25 hectares, but for our environmental statement, we measured it at just over 0.4 hectares. Those measurements were done with handheld GPSs, which were, 6 meters or 8 meters accuracy at the time. So we've managed to improve the accuracy. So by 2017, we were able to find that we reckon we had 0.3 hectares of salt marsh and 0.14 hectares of the transition zone area. I did a quick check with Magic, just using the aerial photography on Magic and the quick method they have of calculating areas there, and that was about 0.34 hectares. So I was quite pleased by that time that we were actually getting a really reasonably accurate measurement, and that's just our baseline really as to going forward as to what we think the salt marsh is and how we'll continue to measure in future. So the initial results, well, it was originally SM13 salt marsh. It's still pretty much SM13 salt marsh. It's species poor, but after 1 year of re-wetting, we had more bare ground and a bit less glasswort and annual sea blight. And so we thought it might be a bit more pioneer. We're actually really worried at this stage because it used to be this bright green salt marsh and then went to this bare ground sort of stuff, quite brown. So it's quite concerning. But the latest surveys in 2019 showed there'd been a decline in common salt marsh grass and an increase in sea arrowgrass, glasswort and sea aster. Sea arrowgrass is actually slow growing and a poor colonizer, so we're actually quite pleased about this. Glasswort is an annual species, so this can quite rapidly change. On the previous slide, I'd suggested that it declines, so obviously there's a lot of stuff going on, there's a lot of dynamism happening, but basically we think it's becoming more of a low marsh community, which is what you'd expect if you were increasing the amount of seawater in. So I think this was all quite positive. And this slide just shows the salt marsh. As I said, the less salt marsh grass and the more of the sea aster. And more of this stuff, the glasswort. This is very much, you know, a pioneer species. It's an annual species. It comes in quite quickly on bare ground and colonize it, but then it dies back every year and leaves this bare ground area, which is why the salt marsh was starting to look so brown. So as I said, going forward, we'll continue to monitor it. We'll continue to check the areas of the salt marsh. We'll continue to check the MVC, and well, probably not the MVC itself because it's still unlikely to change from SM13, but we will be checking to look for species competition, see how that might be changing over time. So I'll just leave you with a picture of the construction of the Queensferry crossing from the seawall. Nice bit of sea thrift in the foreground there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a great example of sort of long-term management and monitoring in the face of a massive infrastructure project. So that's excellent. Next up is Zoe Cleland, the area manager for Central Scotland, RSPB Scotland, going to talk about the Inner Forth Nature Network. Zoe graduated in ecology from Edinburgh University, and she's covered a variety of roles within the RSPB since then, started as a volunteer, becoming a Wetlands Policy Officer, then Conservation Officer for Central Scotland, then Conservation Manager, and now she's the Area Manager for Central Scotland, which is a new role, bringing together all aspects of RSPB work in this area and a lot of the Forth, including nature reserves, conservation work, casework, projects, and people management. She's also delivering the Inner Forth Futures Partnership, which is landscape scale working, delivering that through project delivery, and is also chair of the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy Landscape Scale Conservation Working Group. So that's a very long name back. Zoe is also RSPB's representative on the Clyde Marine Planning Partnership, which of course is the first draft regional marine plan to be set up. So thank you very much for joining us today, Zoe.
Thanks very much, Chris. Can I just check you can hear me okay and you can see my slides? Yes?
Sorry, I muted. Yes, I can, certainly.
Great. With no spare boxes, good. No. Okay, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this seminar today. What I'm going to talk about is some of our work, particularly within the Inner Firth of Forth. Some of that will be from an RSPB perspective, but the vast majority of what I'm going to touch on is work that's been delivered through a partnership of organisations, which are shown on the screen here, the little box of logos at the bottom, some of whom I know are in the room, so hopefully I'll do their contributions justice, and some of which has been funded by the lottery and EcoCo Life. So what I thought I'd do is try and reflect on the two aims of today's seminar that have been outlined, thinking about the challenges and opportunities for biodiversity and the difference planners can make in that world within the Firth of Forth. To do that, I'm going to try and briefly touch on the ecological and management issues that have really led us to focus quite a lot of work in this area. Describe to you a little bit about the strategic partnership approach we've taken, which we feel is a good solution to tackling some of those. Very quickly touch on some site-based opportunities that have come out of that collaborative work, but largely I'd like to emphasise the value we think there is in taking a network approach to considering biodiversity management in this world, and that's where the difference for planners comes in for me. I hope by the end of what I'm going to say I might convince you that using and advocating that kind of network approach is a helpful tool to underpin decision making and planning in the coastal and marine environment. I should give a slight caveat and say that there will be a bit of terrestrial stuff in there as well. What I'm going to say applies to both the coastal and the terrestrial environment. So very briefly to start with, just to emphasise that the Inner Firth of Forth is fantastically important for wildlife. Its salt marshes and mudflats are particularly important for wintering wildfowl and waders who come to spend the winter months within the inner estuary for food and roost sites. And for those reasons, it's designated as an SPA, a Ramsar site, as well as a SSSI. However, most of you will be well aware that this part of Scotland is also a very developed, a very industrialised part of Scotland, and some of those uses do put quite considerable pressure on the wildlife within that area. Some of it's pretty obvious, like the big petrochemical works, or some of the industrial land claim, like here at Valleyfield, which quite clearly has impacted on that intertidal habitat. Some of it is perhaps less obvious. So actually the Inner Firth of Forth, the shape of it today reflects 200 or 300 years of land claim for agriculture. So over quite a long period of time, we've lost half of the soft habitats, the intertidal habitats within the inner estuary. And we now have quite a hard engineered coastal front in many, many places. And of course, we need to layer on top of that the impacts of climate change. So I think probably in the past decade, we've become more and more aware that you know, perhaps previously we thought we were a bit protected from some of these impacts up in the northeast corner of the UK, but in actual fact here we're still going to see the impacts of rising sea level, of erosion effects and storm surge effects, which have a real impact in terms of loss of intertidal habitats through coastal squeeze, so an impact on wildlife, as well as impacts on land managers within that estuary. So those are the kind of challenges that led us, I think really about just over 10 years ago now, to really look at our work in the area and realise that we needed to take a more strategic, a more partnership approach to how we were engaging with some of these big challenges. And that led to us establishing the Inner Forth FUTURESCAPE, one of our landscape scale projects across the UK, trying to find solutions to these kind of challenges through more habitat creation and restoration. And we did an initial piece of work there in kind of 2010 to 11, where we did some mapping work, partly desk-based, but also ground truthing, to really get out and look and find out where we felt the opportunities would be for creation of new habitat and management of existing habitat in the coastal and intertidal areas within the Inner Forth. And part of the result of that is this map, which shows outlined in red some of those sites where we identified there was potential. Obviously, this is looks pretty much still like quite a traditional nature conservation approach, very much habitat and species based, but thinking about some of the other environmental services and ecosystem services that could be driven by that habitat creation. I think it's fair to say that at that point we had a bit of a stop and a think about how we could make some of these happen on the ground, and it became really clear that the delivery mechanisms and the levers don't exist in Scotland. They're not here to make this a reality, and that's clearly a big problem for us. So what we did is what we often do, and turn to project funding to try and make some of this happen. And out of that came the Inner Forth Landscape Initiative. Again, very much a partnership approach to trying to deliver positive change within this part of the estuary. That included a whole range of different projects. We applied for lottery funding and delivered a whole range of conservation, historic, built, cultural, access, skills training, volunteering projects, a real mix, 54 projects over 4.5 years with a value of over £4 million. And I think it's true to say that we realised we needed to go down this route to make some of the habitat work happen, but actually it's also been a fantastic way to work. We've managed to do something much more integrated, more holistic, and to deliver a lot more benefits than if we looked at the habitat in isolation. And I think for us that's been a real step change in how we work in a very positive way. However, one of the projects that we did deliver through that initiative was the skin flats managed realignment here at our reserve beside the Kincardine Bridge. So it's only one of those 54, but for us it's a really important project to demonstrate just what is possible in terms of habitat creation within this coastal environment. And you can see from the picture that we have created a breach in the sea wall there. We have secondary defences on the edge of the site to make sure it's well controlled and managed. But we've created something in the region of 20 hectares of intertidal habitat within that site. It's not huge, but it really shows the potential for what can be done elsewhere in the Forth, going back to our map of potential sites. So this is us taking a very much project-funded, site-based approach, and it's what we often have to do. But I'd like to now come on to the kind of habitat network thinking part of this. So Skin Flats was match funded as part of the EcoCo Life project, which was led by SNH, as was at the time. And this was based on the concept of taking a kind of what was termed an ecological coherence approach to thinking about where to do habitat creation. And this is the kind of schematic that the SNH started the project with. The concept being that if you understand the habitat networks, if you understand where ecosystem services are required, and where the practical opportunity areas are, you should be able to come up with the best places to focus such work. And that's what we did throughout this project. Lots of the conservation NGOs helped with the delivery of some of those practical projects on the ground, including Skin Flats. But as we got to the end of that life project, the partnership realised it would be really helpful to have a way to explain and convey this to the outside world and to encourage other people to take a similar approach. So we led that piece of work at the end of the life funded project, using the Inner Forth as a practical case study to test this way of working and to come up with some guidance for other people. And we did that by looking at the key habitats within the Inner Forth area. So as I said, these are both the terrestrial and the coastal ones. And we ran a series of co-design workshops where we got together the people who really know about the area, they know about the ecology and the habitats and the sites, and we used their local knowledge as well as map-based data to come up with some habitat network maps. What's important about these is they set out not just where existing habitat that needs protected is, but also where there's aspiration, where we think we should, there's potential to connect and to enlarge those habitats. And it gives an idea of priority as to which types of habitats are perhaps more desirable than others in certain places. So what we've come out with at the end of that process is a map. I'm not sure it's the most beautiful in the world, but it kind of does the job. And bear in mind, this is a trial and a first attempt at this. It shows at a kind of regional scale an ambitious habitat network for the area. And there's a second map that shows the eastern part of the area as well. And what it does is indicate where there are areas that we think should be conserved and protected and where there's potential for expansion. And because it shows a degree of prioritization in terms of which habitat the partnership felt was of greatest priority in each area, it should help to direct and prioritize resources and decision making. That's very much the intention. So that was the useful product for us. But what we also did was produce this practitioner's guide explaining the process, explaining that approach to people so that we hope it can be replicated elsewhere, and it is already being used in that way. And you'll see that the diagram on the front there is a kind of a development of that original Venn diagram, trying to indicate that this is more of a process that you can come at from different starting points. But what you should do is end up with the best places to work for people and nature. And so that guide's available to anyone that wants to make use of it. What we also did was come up with a call to action. The partnership is just finalising this now, actually. Really looking at within that network, what are the projects, what are the sites, what are the places where we need to focus attention if we're to see that habitat network become a reality. And that includes for the intertidal area. And this also outlines some of the challenges and the barriers that we think need to be overcome. And the whole point of doing this, producing the map and the call to action, is really to help people to focus efforts at a time when funding is tight and it's difficult to make things happen on the places that are most important. So we hope it'll be useful to develop projects. We hope it will help funders to direct resources to the highest priorities that have been collectively established. We very much hope that it will be helpful to people in a planning sense, either taking decisions or making long-term land use plans. And that's from not just a town and country planning perspective, but also from a land use perspective as we move into a world of regional land use strategies in the future. And I think that's where, you know, the second question for today's seminar comes in. How can planners make a difference? Well, we hope that this tool will enable those decisions and that thinking to be well informed, and to reflect that kind of collective view in an area like the Inner Forth. And I think finally what I'd just like to say is I think there's a really important strategic fit here. So we've done this at a kind of regional level, and that has ended up tying in very nicely, I hope, with what's coming out of NPF4, with the evolution and development of regional spatial strategies. So this is a map that's taken from the indicative regional spatial strategy that's just been developed for the Forth Valley. So for the same area, you can see Stirling, Alloa and Falkirk shown on the map there. And the pale green shading is what's described in the key as a Forth Valley green-blue network. And so you can see this is absolutely where I hope our habitat network might fit in. It's fantastic to see that green-blue network shown within the regional spatial strategy. I'm really pleased to see that. But actually, if you're an implementer, a decision maker, that green shading isn't going to give you very much information on which to base decisions or thought processes. So what we hope is that the level of detail that we've produced through that habitat map will slot in underneath that and be able to help with that process. And finally, I'd just like to say that you know, we're big advocates of Scotland's Nature Network, the concept of having a spatially defined national ecological network for Scotland, you know, really enshrined in sort of planning legislation and policy. And that's something we very much hope will happen in the years to come. It's the commitment to do that is there in NPF3. But what people often ask is, well, what does that mean at a local level? What will that mean to implementers? And so the work that we've done here in the Inner Forth, I hope, provides a bit of a pilot, a bit of a test for what that might look like at a regional scale that would help to inform prioritisation of resources and land use decision making in the future. So it's, we hope, a very helpful pilot in that context as well. So that's all I'm going to say just now. There's obviously lots of detail below all of this, and if you'd like any more information, I've put a couple of links on the slide here which would help you to find out a bit more, or of course feel free to get in contact with me if you'd like to discuss any of it in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Zoe. That I've been obviously sort of watching the Inner Forth Landscape Initiative over several years, and it must be by now sort of a world-leading example of what a lot of partners putting together and collaborating can achieve over a landscape scale, and it's happening right on our doorstep, so thank you. Can I just stress to all the delegates that we will have a Q&A after the last talk, and if you missed the beginning of the seminar, you can enter questions in the Q&A button on your screen, and then you can go over questions at the end. So next up is Katie Bourne, who is going to present a case study on strategic management of flood risk and biodiversity in the Humber estuary. So that's another estuary with similar issues to ourselves, so very relevant for today. Katie is a chartered environmentalist based in Edinburgh with Jacob, with 18 years experience in consultancy, specialising in environmental impact assessments and sustainability. She largely works on flood and coastal risk management in both England and Scotland, but has also worked in transport and renewable sector for a range of public and private sector clients, has a keen interest in promoting a step change in sustainability and is working closely with the Environment Agency in England in delivering shared ambitions and working towards net zero carbon. So thank you very much, Katie.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you can see the screen. Here's an outline of the talk. So we'll provide some context to the Humber estuary and our flood risk management work there with the Environment Agency, and how the revision of the strategy has been changing how we may be approaching biodiversity in a more holistic systems approach way, which chimes very nicely with what Zoe's just been advocating on the previous talk. Here's the study area for our flood risk management work for the Humber estuary. It's in the north of England, and the catchment itself drains 20% of the UK's rainwater. And there are major tidal risks here from the estuary and the tributaries, affecting over 140,000 hectares. This area is home to around 500,000 people and 14,000 businesses, many of which are concentrated in the cities of Hull and Grimsby and Goole. Further inland, we've got parts of Doncaster, Selby and Gainsborough, which are also at risk when the tidal surges and high river flows coincide. We have the Ouse and Trent, Ayr and River Hull, major watercourses in this area too. So the flood defences around the estuary edge are largely comprised of grassy earth embankments, and there's more formal concrete defences around the urban areas. It's of international importance for nature conservation and biodiversity. It's a large, muddy, microtidal estuary, so it provides a highly productive ecosystem supporting a wide range of habitats and species, with large areas of intertidal and subtidal habitats, associated saline lagoons and sand dunes and standing waters. The assemblage of breeding birds is of importance too. The wildfowl and wader numbers can rise as high as 200,000 during winter months. It also supports various mammals, fish, invertebrates and plants, some of which are rare and threatened, including natterjack toads, grey seals, river and sea lamprey. It's recognised as one of the most important estuaries in Europe for nature conservation and protected totally by multiple designations. We've got here SAC, SPA, Ramsar, SSSI. And further inland, we have other sites of nature conservation importance, including floodplain meadows, river watercourses and peatlands. So the estuary supports a diverse range of fish communities, and there's over 85 species present, and with the improvements to water quality in the inner estuary and reaches of the River Ouse, we've now got the return of migratory fish species like salmon and trout. It's also a very important area for other key features. It's nationally important for the ports and industry around Grimsby, Immingham, Hull and Goole. These are key trade gateways linking the UK market with Europe and beyond. It's a major area for supporting the UK's power with imports into the Humber ports and also growth of the offshore renewable sector. There's vital infrastructure links, including the iconic Humber Bridge, and a large area of productive agricultural land. And with the recent floods in tidal surge in 2013, we had over 7,000 hectares of agricultural land flooded. So there's a lot of importance of the industries here that when they're affected by tidal flooding on the Humber, it actually has a wider impact throughout the UK. This slide is explaining a bit around the need for the strategic management of flood risk in the Humber estuary. So we know that there are extreme flood events from tidal surges, And the most deadly was in January 1953 across the east of England, which, and other parts of Europe, which you'll be aware of, no doubt. And then through the early to mid 1990s, the Environment Agency commenced with a series of urgent works programs. So they were doing piecemeal improvements. The condition of the flood defences was substantiated in many places, as shown in the photographs there, due to erosion and the heights of the crests. And also the likelihood of overtopping and breaching was increasing with the sea level rise and increased storminess risks. Then with the introduction of the habitats regulations, this gave the Environment Agency an increased need to consider the effects of flood defence works on the SAC, SPA, European sites, and the effects that coastal squeeze might be having on the European sites. And it was all becoming apparent. So even when they are maintaining the existing defence line, there could potentially be an adverse effect on the integrity of the European sites because the presence of flood walls and flood banks might be preventing habitats from migrating inland as the sea levels are rising. So that's coastal squeeze. So the Environment Agency set about to produce a 50-year strategy to manage the flood risk more strategically, but also to secure the nature conservation interests for the future. So the Environment Agency produced the flood risk management strategy for the Humber in 2008 called Planning for the Rising Tides. So it covers 50 years of flood risk management around the whole estuary. It comprised of the strategy documents, but we also carried out a strategic environmental assessment, Water Framework Directive assessment, and interestingly, the strategic habitat regulations assessment. And this is what a lot of the rest of the talk will focus on. So this strategic HRA went through each of the stages of HRA appropriate assessment to identify that there were no alternatives and IROP, and agreed a compensation package with Natural England, which was based on various ratios of replacement habitats that would be being predicted as being lost, either directly from the proposed flood protection works or from the coastal squeeze effects that were being predicted over a 25-year program of works. There was also a review of the potential in combination effects that could be created from other projects, particularly the ports projects, but also the program of works itself around the estuary. And as a result of that, they created a major program of habitat creation for compensatory habitat reasons to generate large areas of intertidal habitat through managed realignment. And also, as a result of this large-scale flood risk management strategy, by 2021, it will have improved the standard of flood protection to around 70,000 properties, and a lot of those major infrastructure assets that we talked about earlier. So here are some pictures of the major managed realignment projects that have been delivered to date in the Humber. Under the strategy then, so over 350 hectares of intertidal habitat has been created to date as compensation for the impacts of the strategy under the habitat regulations. The far left one, the before and after picture, shows Alkborough Flats, which is in the inner estuary, completed in 2006. This is 170 hectares of intertidal habitat. It also is acting as a flood storage area when there's extreme events, holding back the water. The middle picture's the first one we completed, Paul Home Strays, 80 hectares of intertidal habitat. And the other one is Donna Nook, which was most recently completed in the outer estuary. That's 109 hectares. We've also got planning secured for an additional site on the outer north part of the estuary at Skeffling. And alongside it, the Environment Agency managed realignment sites. The associated British ports have also undertaken schemes at Chowderness and Welwick. And now we're working on a renewed strategy for the flood risk management of the estuary. This is now called Humber 2100 Plus because it goes beyond the previous timescale over 100 years. It was time for a new review anyway, but a few other things happened that means that a comprehensive review was beneficial. We had the largest tidal surge in 2013. Thankfully, no fatalities, but large number of properties and agricultural land were flooded. We've had reviewed sea level rise predictions in the UKCP. The Environment Agency has formed partnerships for developing the strategy with the 12 local authorities shown here and the Humber LEP, that's the Local Enterprise Partnership, to help implement and prioritise local needs through the strategy. And there have also been various policy changes. So this Humber 2100 Plus will be published in 2023, and it's expected to show that we can't protect everywhere given the scale of the increasing risk and the challenge of dealing with a 1.3 metre estimated sea level rise. It'll focus on storing water strategically where we can and protecting the major assets and communities, taking an adaptive pathway approach to deal with the uncertainties over the 100-year period and the major monitoring programme. And as part of that, we were considering how we could do more for the estuarine biodiversity. So the previous strategy had a large focus on compliance with the nature conservation legislation, largely habitat regulations, which was driving us to intertidal habitat creation around the estuary. But we wondered, was that the best deal for biodiversity? And so through our discussions of the managed realignment sites that we've produced so far, we know that managed realignment has very high nature conservation values and benefits. However, there are a few things that we could be working on here. The sustainability of the mudflat is hard. It's harder to maintain that because of the amount of sediment coming in from the estuary due to the sediment load. The intertidal habitats are dynamic and changing. It's very hard to predict how this might be happening, and indeed how much is relating to coastal squeeze or other types of causes. We're wondering if there could be a tipping point where the growth of salt marsh can't keep a pace with the sea level rise in the future and we would become drowned out. But we need to think when that might be. We're also concerned that we've been focused on the areas that have changed and lost and gained, but wondering if there are other more habitat quality issues that we should be focusing on too. And we're wondering, is this the best deal we could do for nature conservation? And we believe we could provide something better, a better value and more integrated approach, thinking about the systems to manage nature conservation in the estuary. This would be aimed to improve the overall health, resilience and adaptability of the environmental system. So a bit more about this holistic approach here, which does chime with what Zoe was saying during her presentation. So this is thinking about a more integrated approach by understanding how the system works through the different components like hydromorphology, physicochemistry and ecology, how they interact with each other and the systems and how they may change. We will be able to put in place something that will help improve the overall health, resilience and adaptability of the ecosystems. And we know that there'll be not only the pressures from flood risk management activities, but also the climate change, sea level rise effects, and lots of other pressures that are in the estuary. So, so now we're thinking of trying to move away from just focusing on habitats regulations compliance to create intertidal habitats. But if we understood all of the future drivers and long-term trends that are affecting the natural environment, we can promote a more holistic, integrated way of managing the estuary and produce a range of ecological measures as a network of sites and interventions, delivering a range of natural capital enhancements and a range of ecosystem services. Some of these would be delivered through the flood risk management strategy, the Humber 2100 plus, and some would be delivered by other stakeholders. We think this is a bit of a novel approach, although it is based on the TIDA project in continental Europe, the Tidal River Development project. There's a website there if anybody's interested in finding out more about a systems-based approach. There's some information there on a systems approach on the TIDA website. And the only other final point to make there is that we think this approach will help support the new flood risk management plan from the national strategy from the Environment Agency, but also the government's 25-year environment plan about delivering biodiversity net gain and natural capital and promoting more valuable ecosystem services through our coastal wetlands and the wider benefits around carbon sequestration and people's health and well-being, as well as flood resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was excellent, and I think there's a lot to be gained in sort of the cross sort of pollination of ideas between sort of various sort of estuarine systems in the UK in the face of sort of common problems like biodiversity loss, flood risk management, and climate change. So that's really interesting to hear. So that's all the presentations. As promised, we can go into a Q&A session now. Some of you have been writing down some questions that the panelists can answer. So I'll just start by reading out some questions to throw out to the panelists. One question is, some species are habituated to human beings and may indeed benefit from their presence. What are the planning and other opportunities for protecting the others from disturbance by people and dogs while still allowing access for recreation? So there's some sort of planning opportunities there for protecting wildlife from disturbance. Would anyone care to field that?
I'm happy to comment on that, Chris.
Thanks, Zoe.
Others may wish to come in. I mean, I guess for me, there's a couple of things at a site-based level, because I'm just thinking it's something we have to think about. For example, with our own sites, with a nature reserve, it's a very live issue when we're managing a site. So for me, it's about thinking about those multiple uses and zoning an area and understanding where might need to be managed in such a way as it's a bit of a refuge, and where we might encourage public access in a way that's responsible. But I think from a planning perspective, there's some important points there, because it's certainly something we've found to be problematic in terms of built development around estuaries quite frequently, is the failure to take into account the disturbance impacts that arise from built development, for example, housing or holiday accommodation or something. And there's a real need for people assessing and making decisions in that way to take into account those cumulative impacts, and the ones that don't come from the building of the thing, but from the use in the long term. And that's for us been quite a significant issue for years in both the Clyde and the Forth.
I'll talk about something as well. I do a lot of habitats regulations work, and so on something like the Firth of Forth, we've had a lot of experience of working with the designated features of the site, which for the Firth of Forth is mainly birds, but there are other features as well. And through that, there is definite ways that you have to look at the potential for disturbance of the features. What is missing, obviously, is more widespread or common species that don't have a designation or aren't protected in any other way. And there isn't really a mechanism to look at the disturbance of those, except in a very broad and general way. I mean, a good example, I think, of those some of our common species, for instance, bird species, which have shown a sort of a significant decline according to, you know, so they'll be red listed on the not JNCC, sorry, the RSPB website as bird species which have undergone a significant decline, but we think of them as quite widespread, like house sparrows and things like that. And although they do benefit from human presence through, you know, bird boxes and bird feeding and stuff like that, there'll be species like that which will be affected and won't fall under any particular EIA or HABS regs designation or anything where we can sort of slot it into nicely, really.
Thank you both for that. Yes, there's some interesting caveats there as to what species sort of fall through the cracks, as it were. This is a question for Katie Bourne. What makes you question if something better could be done in terms of nature conservation for the Humber project? Do the areas where they have been managed, where there has been managed realignment, have poor biodiversity, and how can these areas be made better?
Okay, yes, thanks. I probably underplayed the amazing habitats and species that are in our new managed realignment sites around the Humber estuary. They have developed very quickly, and an awful lot of supporting a lot of the integrity of the SAC and SPA and Ramsar site. We have had some issues thinking about the longer term longevity of those sites and how Natural England and stakeholders are have ambitions for those sites to remain as mudflat, and how much sort of tinkering and gardening might be required to keep them like as a predominantly mudflat habitat, and also the specific targeted species that have been associated with the designs of those sites and getting them signed off. So also we know that and in the long term, with the long-term trends, we need to be thinking about transitional habitats and the freshwater habitats and the wider benefits that we can have from a network of sites around the estuary, not just at the frontage. So I mean, there are some, I'm sure I'm probably not the best person to be talking about the individual managed realignment sites and what could be done on them to make them more biodiverse, but we know that each time we're designing a new one, they're getting more complicated and more expensive and less sustainable to maintain if we are trying to keep them as the type of habitat that we've been losing from our impacts from our projects as a compensation for those impacts. So it was just a chance to step back and think more holistically about how we can improve the long-term resilience and adaptability in the face of climate change effects as well as other pressures. So not just the losses or changes due to the flood risk management activities, but everything, so that the estuary can be in a better place going forwards. Thank you. I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. Another question. Given all the uncertainties whenever creation and maintenance of intertidal flats or salt marshes is attempted, is the blue carbon argument for managed realignment sufficiently mature to help pull in investment? So that could go out to Zoe or Katie or John? Or...
Well, I don't have a very clear vision of how you can fund blue carbon projects. The reason why the Environment Agency was able to do their programme of over 300 hectares of managed realignment sites so far was on the back of the habitat regulations due to predicted losses that needed to be compensated from their work. So I don't know that there's an official route to funding the carbon mitigation specifically at the moment. I think that's still being debated. Do any of the other panelists know about that side of things?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that if that's okay. I think there's 2 points I'd make on this. I mean, one is I think it's really worth spelling out the difference with what Katie's described in the Humber and the situation we're working with here. It's a really fundamental difference where the Environment Agency has taken a really lead role, and the reasons for that are to do with the roles and responsibilities of that organisation, which are quite different to the roles and responsibilities of both SEPA and SNH in Scotland. And so what that's enabled or forced the Environment Agency to do is drive forward that big programme of managed realignment and habitat creation, which has not happened in Scotland, which is why we've got these kind of small examples of projects like the one I described at Skinflats. And that for me is massively problematic, and it's something we've been arguing shouldn't be the case in Scotland for a long time. But you know, to date, not really any sign of that about to change. So it's really important to understand that some of those responsibilities that sit with the Environment Agency in England sit with private landowners in Scotland, and that is the reason why this is not happening up here and it's stalling. So that's part of the funding and legislative background that I think really needs to change, because we can do as many plans as we want. If we don't have the mechanisms for delivery, it won't happen. On the carbon one, I think that's a really interesting point. There's so much emphasis in Scotland, and it's fantastic to see the investment in peatland restoration. The money that's coming through the Scottish Government to promote peatland restoration is wonderful. It's great to see that happen. But I would love a similar, degree of support to be available for other kinds of carbon capture, and primarily for blue carbon. And I think the important thing we need to understand here is, like with peatland restoration, there are multiple benefits to be gained from intertidal restoration, which Katie's described really well. And that's what we need to be thinking about, not this just as a habitat creation for biodiversity, which it is, and great in its own right, but that it's a way for us to address these other problems. And that message has now got through, I think, with peatland. Be wonderful if it could come through with blue carbon as well.
Thank you very much, Zoe and Katie. That's a lot of food for thought there. It's very interesting, though, obviously, the different mechanisms between the two nations. I think, is there another question? This is a question to Zoe. Right after explaining the inner forth mapping work in 2010, noting the absence of usual levers to make things happen, without wanting to take anything away from the subsequent success of that excellent initiative, I wonder what were the normal levers that were absent that led to the need for an alternative approach?
I guess I was really meaning the things I've just described, that in Scotland, there haven't been the same legislative and funding routes that have come through flood management in England, and a combination of a need to do flood management with habitat regulation assessment and water framework directive obligations. So for me, I think that's the combination in England, and Katie can correct me if I'm wrong here, but that has really driven two things. One, it's driven people to look for soft engineering approaches rather than building seawalls, which first preference. But secondly, if we're in a situation, and we are in one in the Firth of Forth, with the flood defences proposed for Grangemouth, where we will get into those EROPI arguments and a need for compensation, that we must understand where there are opportunities to deliver compensatory habitat, and so they will kick in. But the things that I was referring to as not being there are that strategic flood management approach, and acceptance by a lot of decision makers and legislators in Scotland that the loss of habitats due to sea level rise is something that should be built into in combination assessments and cumulative assessments when it comes to habitat regulation assessment. Something that we've advocated for a long time. Katie referred to it, but still an argument that's not always easy to play out here in Scotland. And also that we don't have routes through our agricultural support systems to pay farmers to do these kind of long-term projects which would deliver multiple benefits. Many of the farms and the fields around the Inner Forth are pump drained using diesel pumps at great cost to the individual landowner, obviously environmental cost, to maintain agricultural production of high yield in those areas. That's not a sustainable system, but until we replace that with something that incentivizes those land managers to do something different, we can't expect them to do something different.
Thank you, Zoe. Yes, I think in the absence of any more questions being typed, that's probably a good point to finish. What we've just been talking about in terms of managing reliance on estuaries just makes me think of, if in the absence of suitable mechanisms, that might be a great avenue for additionality in any sort of regional marine plan to come forward. Just saying. So yes, I think that has been excellent and some good questions there. So thank you everyone for contributing. I'd like to formally thank CIEEM for organising the mechanics of this webinar today and coming into partnership with us, the forum, in hosting this webinar. It's worked really well, and the booking process obviously went without a hitch, and it's been excellent to see so many people tuning in this morning to watch and listen. So I'd like to thank all the attendees, and I'd especially like to thank the speakers for presenting today. It's all been very varied and interesting. And I would like to just encourage everyone who's attended, if they could fill out the feedback evaluation forms that will be sent to you along with a link to the video of this webinar. That'd be great, because that will really responses from the evaluations will really sort of contribute to the forum, and I hope CIEEM in developing webinars over the near future without having to sort of physically meet up. I think it's a great mechanism for getting ideas out and getting some debate going. So I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you all. Christy, I don't know if you'd like to say anything?
No, I think you said it perfectly. Yeah, a massive thank you to you all from me, and thank you to the attendees. And yes, I'll send out a feedback survey and the link later this afternoon.
That's excellent. Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.